Good morning, good evening, or good 3 a.m. doom scroll, depending on which time zone decided to bring you here today. Either way, welcome back to Borderlines. Pull up a chair, because we are not easing into this one. There is a very specific kind of person you meet at some point in your life. The kind of person who, mid-argument with their spouse, mid-shouting match with the waiter, mid-meltdown over something completely unrelated, will suddenly turn to the one person in the room who has genuinely wronged them in the past. An old rival, someone who owes them money, someone who has been quietly undermining them for years, and greet that person with warmth, real warmth, compliments, an arm around the shoulder, and everyone else at the table just sort of sits there, food going cold, wondering what exactly they walked into. I mention this not because I have a particular fascination with dysfunctional dinner parties, but because it is, almost beat for beat, what happened inside the Oval Office this week. And by the end of this, you are going to understand why the people who should be most alarmed by it are not in Pyongyang or Tehran. They are in Washington. Let's start with the room itself, because the room tells you almost everything. The occasion officially was a 16-year-old lifeguard from California being honored for saving a 10-year-old from drowning. A good story, a clean story. The kind of story a White House desperately short on clean stories usually milks for every ounce of warmth it can get. Instead, within minutes, the room had turned into something else entirely. A press secretary telling a CNN correspondent to be quiet in front of the teenager they were supposed to be honoring. The correspondent being informed she was a loud, boisterous person, and, of course, fake news. And the president fielding real, specific, uncomfortable questions about a nuclear-armed dictator, a starving aircraft carrier, and an ally he had just threatened to bomb. All while a 16-year-old stood there, wondering, I assume, whether this was normal. It was not normal, but it was revealing, in the way that a person's behavior at their most stressed is always the most revealing thing about them. Here is the sequence, because the order matters. The president was asked why Kim Jong-un, a man who has spent the better part of a decade threatening to nuke the United States, who has by some estimates up to 60 nuclear warheads, several of which may be capable of reaching American soil, had not responded to his outreach. The answer was a version of yes, he has responded. We are in conversation. And it's very positive. Very positive. About a man he once bragged, in his own words, about exchanging love letters with. Meanwhile, in the same appearance, the president was asked about the Sultanate of Oman, a country currently doing the extremely unglamorous, unrewarded work of quietly mediating a deal over the Strait of Hormuz on behalf of an administration that badly needs that deal, and his answer, delivered the day before to Fox News, was that if Oman got in the way, the United States would, in his words, bomb the S out of them. When a reporter followed up and asked whether he was losing patience with Oman as a strategic partner, he said Oman hadn't behaved very well, but that the U.S. would handle them very easily, just like we do other things. Sit with that pairing for a second. The bloodthirsty dictator gets love letters. The quiet mediator, the one actually doing the administration a favor, gets threatened with bombing on national television. That is not a foreign policy. That is a mood. And then there was South Korea, which is really where this whole thing stops being merely strange and starts being genuinely consequential. The president recounted, seemingly proudly, a phone call in which he asked South Korea's president for help with the Iran situation. South Korea reasonably said, "No, thank you." The president's response, as he told it himself, "Wait a minute, we have 39,000 soldiers over there guarding you from Kim Jong-un, your next-door neighbor. And you're not going to help us on a very easy military operation in Iran? That's strange." And so, citing that refusal, along with, and I want you to really absorb this part, his ongoing charm offensive toward the very dictator those 39,000 troops exist to deter, the administration scaled back the annual joint military exercises with South Korea, downsized them, over an 11-day drill. Because an ally declined to get involved in a Middle Eastern military operation, it had no obligation to join on a peninsula where the war that started in 1950 never technically ended. It stopped, it did not end. There's a difference. Ask anyone who's been divorced but never actually signed the papers. So let's just say the quiet part now, since nobody in that briefing room seemed inclined to. The United States is currently reducing military cooperation with a treaty ally that borders a nuclear state, over that ally's refusal to help fight an unrelated war 8,000 kilometers away, while simultaneously describing warm and positive relations with the nuclear state itself. If you wrote that into a script for a satire show, a network note would come back asking you to make it more believable. Now why? Why does any of this happen? And here I think the useful thing is not to search for some grand strategic doctrine, because there isn't one. I promise you, nobody in that room has a whiteboard with this mapped out. The far more boring, far more accurate explanation is the one that usually explains erratic behavior in any institution, family, or nation. There is no good news to talk about, so someone starts manufacturing drama in whatever direction is available. A Reuters poll out that same morning had the president's approval rating at 33%, an all-time low. Iowa, a state won 3 consecutive times by roughly 10 points, was suddenly being described by his own party's strategists as a state Republicans needed to worry about, with campaign surrogates being dispatched there in a mild panic. There was no positive headline available. So, the administration reached for the only tool that has ever reliably generated headlines for this particular White House, which is conflict DAO, and when the actual foreign policy conflicts weren't producing enough heat, they manufactured a domestic one instead. Which brings us to the reporter. Kristen Holmes, a CNN correspondent, asked the president a straightforward, entirely legitimate question, a follow-up on comments made by Senator Jon Ossoff, who had said the president appeared more interested in traveling with a close aide than doing the actual job of commander-in-chief. That's it. That's the offense. What followed was not a rebuttal. It was the White House's official rapid response account, publicly calling her a, quote, disgraceful, humiliating embarrassment to her alleged profession. And this is the part that should make anyone, regardless of politics, deeply uncomfortable. Adding that her children would one day come across the question and be, quote, sickened and embarrassed to have a parent be so callous and vindictive. I want to be very precise about what happened there, because it's worth being precise about. An official government communications account invoked a journalist's children as a rhetorical weapon in response to a question about scheduling priorities. Not a scandal, not a crime, a scheduling question. And the effect of that overreaction, predictably, was not to bury the Ossoff story. It was to extend it. Ossoff spent the following days doing exactly what any smart politician would do with a gift like that, going on every available platform to talk about the White House's reaction to his speech, which is, of course, considerably more oxygen than the original speech would ever have gotten on its own. The White House, in trying to punish a critic, produced several additional news cycles for that critic, entirely free of charge. If there's a more efficient own goal in modern communication strategy, I haven't seen it, and I genuinely go looking. And underneath all of this, underneath the reporter, underneath Ossoff, underneath the noise, sits a story that got almost none of the coverage the theater around it got, which is the USS Abraham Lincoln. This is an aircraft carrier that has, according to multiple outlets independently corroborating accounts from the families of the sailors aboard it, been at sea for roughly 9 months without a proper port call, its last stop back in December, in Guam. Reports, again, from families, not from anonymous sources with an axe to grind, from the actual relatives of the people serving, describe sailors jumping off the ship, food shortages, deteriorating conditions. Asked about it directly, twice in 2 separate settings, the president's answer was, first, that it was a fake report from CNN, backed by an unnamed retired admiral he says approached him at an event and told him the ship was beautifully maintained. And second, days earlier, when asked whether the deployment had gone on too long, his answer was, not nearly long enough. Now, a retired rear admiral who actually commands credibility in this conversation pointed out something worth repeating. The Lincoln, by his account, has already set a record for length of time at sea without a port call, which means the record itself may be the story nobody wanted to say out loud, that this isn't sailors being dramatic. This is a genuinely unprecedented deployment, driven by a war with no clear strategic endpoint. in a region where the ports themselves aren't even safe to resupply from because of ongoing missile and drone threats. There was, according to people who actually understand military planning, no long-term strategy for this conflict, just an assumption that a handful of strikes would produce a fast collapse, the way it was assumed things might go in Venezuela. That assumption did not hold. And so, you get sailors stretched past any reasonable rotation, stockpiles being pulled from the Indo-Pacific to feed a Middle Eastern war with no visible end, and a commander-in-chief whose public response to that reality is to call it fake news and change the subject to how well-maintained the paint job is. Here's the wider frame, because none of this happens in a vacuum, and every one of these individual moments is, on its own, a bad news day. Together, they are something else. The Wall Street Journal's editorial page ran a piece this week under the headline, "Trump Romances Kim Jong-un," and the core argument in it is worth sitting with. That this pattern, cozying up to Pyongyang while berating Seoul, threatening Oman while it's doing you a favor, dismissing the families of American sailors while praising a dictator's love letters, reinforces, in the journal's words, a growing belief across Asia and Europe that the United States is becoming an unreliable ally, not an enemy, not adversarial, just unreliable, which, if you were designing a foreign policy specifically to benefit China, is functionally almost the same outcome, achieved with considerably less effort on China's part. And China is watching all of this extremely closely for a very specific reason. Beijing does not particularly love Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambitions either. The estimate of up to 60 warheads doesn't thrill anyone in the region, including North Korea's supposed patron. But what China dislikes far more than a nuclear-armed neighbor is 30,000 American troops sitting on the Korean peninsula, because if the North Korean regime were ever to collapse, those troops would end up on China's own border. So China has a strategic interest in keeping Kim boxed in, stable, and armed, just enough to justify the American troop presence staying exactly where it is. Not closer to Beijing, not further away. Every time Washington signals it might scale back its commitment to South Korea over a scheduling dispute about Iran, it is not weakening North Korea's position. It is strengthening China's for free without China lifting a single finger. Which is really the through line here. If you zoom back far enough, not that any of these decisions individually is catastrophic, but that the pattern of them, stacked together, is doing exactly the work that America's actual rivals have spent decades and enormous budgets trying to do, fracturing the alliance architecture that has underwritten American influence since the 1950s. Nobody had to hack anything. Nobody had to run an influence operation. All that had to happen was a bad polling week, a reporter asking a fair question, and a president who reaches for conflict the way other people reach for coffee. Iran, for what it's worth, is watching too, and drawing its own lesson from all of this, which is that the American position is not fixed, that the political clock in Washington is working against this administration's leverage, and that hardliners currently holding sway in Tehran have essentially no incentive to negotiate, because unlike the pragmatists who actually feel the weight of economic pressure, the hardliners' only real concern is regime survival, and regime survival, in their calculation, is better served by outlasting an unpopular American president than by making a deal with him. So, where does that leave things, as of this recording? An ally in Seoul quietly recalibrating how much it can depend on Washington. An ally in Muscat absorbing a bombing threat for the crime of trying to help. A carrier full of sailors 9 months into a deployment nobody planned for, told by their own commander-in-chief that their conditions are fine, actually, better than fine, and that a retired admiral at a party said so. A reporter's children invoked in an official government statement over a scheduling question, an approval rating in the low 30s, and a state that voted for this president 3 times in a row, now being triaged by his own party like a patient in an emergency room. None of that reads like strength. It reads like a White House that has run out of good news and decided the next best thing is manufacturing bad news everyone can argue about instead, because an argument, unlike an approval rating, can at least be won on television. The trouble is that alliances don't watch television. They watch behavior. And right now, from Seoul to Muscat to whichever capital is quietly updating its own contingency planning this week, the behavior on display is being read as exactly what it looks like: a superpower that has decided its friends are the safe place to vent, and its adversaries are the safe place to flatter, which is, I suppose, one way to run a foreign policy. It is just not historically the way you keep one. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines, analysis from the edge. If you'd rather understand what's actually happening than watch another panel yell about it, you know what to do. See you at the next border.